Before before we begin, there's a couple of housekeeping items I want to make sure we go over. We're really looking forward to hearing from the audience to make this interactive. So if you want to do that, please introduce yourself in the chat box and start asking questions, and then the questions will make their way to the speakers. There's also simultaneous interpretation in French and Spanish, and you can click on the globe icon on the Zoom platform to change the language to your preferred channel, including obviously English. The session is recorded, and priority access to the recording and related resources will be made available to those who subscribe to the newsletter, and you'll actually get a chance to subscribe during the meeting, as there will be a link in the chat. Now, moving on to the brief background on the session. This session marks the launch of the practice note, Breaking Barriers, Empowering Women Through Economic Inclusion Programs, developed by the Partnership for Economic Inclusion, PEI, at the World Bank. In this first session, we'll explore how economic inclusion programs can promote women's economic empowerment. And we want to make sure we define those terms so everybody has the same understanding. So, economic inclusion. Economic inclusion programs are a bundle of coordinated, multidimensional interventions that help poor and vulnerable people, especially women, access economic opportunities, increase incomes, and build self-reliance. They typically combine income support, for example, cash transfers, with intervention such as entrepreneurship and life skills training, coaching, business capital, and market linkages. Now, the second definition is around women's economic empowerment. I'm sure there are many definitions out there that you all are familiar with, but the one that we'll put forward is the following. Women's economic empowerment refers to women's capacity to participate in and contribute to and benefit from economic activities in a way that recognize the value of their contributions, respect their dignity, and ensure fair and equitable access to economic resources and decision-making. We will start the conversation with a framing presentation, followed by, as you all expect, an exciting lineup of speakers who will share program experience from Kenya, Bangladesh, and Malawi. Then at the end, our discussant will tie these together, and then we'll leave time for live questions and answers from the audience that you'll be able to type into the chat box. Now, I'll pass it on to Nazia Moqueet, who's a social protection specialist from the Partnership for Economic Inclusion. She's one of the authors of the practice note and will share insights from the note on how to design gender intentional economic inclusion programs. Over to you, Nazia.
Thanks, Radu. And hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my slides. But I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about some program and design considerations to improve gender outcomes in economic inclusion programs. And to start off, let's quickly go over the global landscape of economic inclusion programs. So in 2024, we identified over 400 programs in 88 countries that are reaching over 70 million people. Now, the good news is that majority of these programs, so over 90%, target women as the primary participant. But the gap is that only a third of these programs prioritize women's economic empowerment, or WE, as a core objective. Now, what that means is that only a small portion of programs have deliberate strategies or approaches to empower women. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, this looks at those programs that have women have WE as a core objective, and outlines some of the approaches that they're using. So you can see that the programs do a very good job of measuring gender outcomes and also engaging in community sensitization activities. But the main gaps are providing services such as childcare, elder care, and also shifting some of the social norms that keep women out of the labor force. So this brings us to the framework that we use in our newly launched In Practice note that Radu just mentioned. This framework is structured around three pillars: agency, resources, and context. And within these three pillars, we identify constraints that women generally face, and this is the framework that we use to recommend interventions that you should have to maximize the outcomes. So the agency pillar on the left-hand side refers to an individual's capacity to set goals and work towards achieving them. The second pillar, resources, refers to all the financial, human, and social capital resources that women need to succeed in the economy. And the third pillar, context, refers to the customs and norms, the laws and regulations that determine whether women can even enter the labor force. The designing interventions in all these three pillars are important to lead to the main outcomes that we want, which is to increase their labor force participation and also to help women get greater control over their earnings. And the main takeaway from this slide is that designing interventions in one pillar is not enough. You have to have cross-cutting pillars cross-cutting interventions that work towards achieving outcomes across all three pillars. So here are some program and design and delivery considerations, and we of course have more details in our in-practice note, which we'll share at the end. But just to highlight a few recommendations, in the agency pillar, we recommend tailoring content and delivery of life skills training and coaching to address the constraints that women face. There are a lot of examples in the in-practice note that I would recommend you look at, but just to highlight one from DRC, the program provided life skills training on topics such as women's rights, civic action, the ability to negotiate, and that life skills training and the coaching that they received helped them increase their agency and also improve decision-making power within their household. In order to provide that guidance, of course, you need equipped staff. So providing the adequate training to frontline staff who are going to deliver that coaching and training is very important. And a tool that coaches can use is to provide behavioral nudges during the coaching. So we can draw lessons from cash transfer programs in Kenya that helped women develop savings targets. And whenever they received cash transfers, they would receive a text that reminded them to work towards their goals. And we actually found that those women who received these nudges through the text messages whenever they received cash transfers were more likely to achieve their goals than those who did not. If we move to the next pillar on resources, we know livelihoods is a central element of the economic inclusion programs. So having gendered market assessments is very important to identify livelihoods that are appropriate, viable, and also sustainable for women. So they take into account the care burdens that women face, the mobility constraints that they face, and allow them to build sustainable livelihoods. Similarly, tailoring the training delivery is important to accommodate time and mobility constraints. So this means just basic things like providing a safe space for women to train in, a space that's publicly accessible. There are programs in India that show that allowing women to train with a friend often leads to better outcomes. They're more likely to come, they're more likely to participate, and you also see those outcomes translating to higher incomes. To build social capital, we recommend mobilizing women into groups. A lot of programs are doing this already where they have savings groups or they have community groups. And we find that by doing this, women not only can learn from each other, but they can build their ability to be more active in the community spaces and have a voice in their community. If we move on to the third pillar in context, we know that we cannot have true we if we are not engaging men from the outset. So engaging men and community leaders is very important to prevent some of the backlash that happens when women start generating income. There's a lot of shifting norms that's involved in these programs, and we need to make sure that everybody is along for the journey and are supporting women. So this can be done through community sensitization, through the coaching sessions. It's important to engage men through those sessions. And another key way, and I know some of my fellow speakers will be talking about this, is using couples training to engage men. And one recommendation is to leverage audio and visual tools for life skills training. There's a program in Cameroon that used public radio to broadcast messages on the benefits of women's empowerment. And then they also talked about other topics such as resolving family disputes, emotional expression, positive parenting. And then these topics were also reinforced in the program during life skills training and coaching. And this was a really good way to make sure that people were retaining the key messages and that they were also applying them in their daily life. So I'll leave you with this last slide, which is to say that, beyond the recommendations that I just mentioned, the key to having sustainable outcomes is first to start with gendered assessment to identify the constraints that women face. We know women face a lot of constraints related to, of course, access to resources, care burdens, low mobility, and then also social norms. So unless we identify what those constraints are, we cannot design interventions that are adequately suited to their needs. And then the second main recommendation is to pair some of these program level adaptations with broader advocacy for gender equality reform. So we know that these programs do not operate in vacuums. So it's very important that we are also moving to shift some of the laws that affect women, whether it be in provision of childcare and elder care, and then also some of the legislative reforms or regulatory barriers that often keep women out of the workforce by limiting their access to finance and their access to jobs. So we have, of course, more details in our In Practice note, which is launching today. I'll leave you with this QR code, but we'll also drop the link in the chat. So thank you so much. Over to you, Radu.
Great. Thank you, Nazia. So now we'll move on to the sort of the main event of this morning or afternoon, which is the presentations from the experts. And it will be good to highlight that the presentations follow the framework that Nazia described. So we will first hear from panelists talking about work on women's agency, then resources, and then context. With that said, now it's my great pleasure to introduce the first panelist, Lynett Ochuma, who is the director at the State Department for Social Protection and Senior Citizens Affairs in the government of Kenya. And she will present the impact of Kenya's Social and Economic Inclusion Program, KSIP, on women's agency, the first pillar that Nazia described. So over to you, Lynett.
Thank you so much, and I'm happy to be in this webinar and to be part of this whole process. So I'll give you an overview of the Economic Inclusion Program. This is a program that was supported by World Bank and was implemented by the government and non-governmental organization, that is Village Enterprise and BOMA. From the pilot phase, we had it in from 2021 to 2024. We did a pilot in 5 counties and we targeted 10 sub-counties. We implemented this in 2 cohorts. So we had the cohort 1 that was led by the NGO consortium, that is the GDI consortium and Village Enterprise and BOMA. We targeted about 7,300, and as you can see, most of our participants were women, were 67%. In the second cohort, we targeted 7,100 and the women were 69%. So that shows that the economic inclusion, most of the participants are usually women. We also expanded our program, and through the support of FCDO, we moved to 8 counties, and that is in 2024 to 2025. We are in the second phase, which has just started. And in that one, we did so well. We have targeted around 76% women. So we are scaling up. We are going to the second phase of the Kenya Socio-Economic Inclusion Program. And this time round, we have branded it. We are calling it Jumuika Kiuchumi, which we'll have from 2026 to 2030. In our key result area is that we want to ensure that we have 50 plus women being targeted. So our target is 26,000. Then we expect that we will have more than 13,000 of them who are women. So when we were designing the economic inclusion program, we were aware of the gender concerns that are there. In Kenya, one of the key things when it comes to gender is that we have restricted gendered social norms that limit women's empowerment. I'll give you an example of a woman who would want to engage in economic empowerment, but they cannot because they have the roles that they play. For example, in Samburu, which is a county in Kenya, a woman cannot leave the house or cannot leave their home until the livestock have left. And she has to come back before the livestock is brought back to the home. So that really limits them because they are constrained in terms of time. Then they are also not able to participate because they have other competing tasks, the reproductive duties and roles that they have to do, because they have to cook, they have to go fetch water, they have to prepare the firewood, and therefore that limits their participation. And most of the women in Kenya are unemployed, and those ones who are employed, you'll mostly find them in the informal sector. We call them the mama mboga. They are the ones who are selling vegetables in the market. And one of the other issues is that they cannot even access credit because most of the property that they could use even as collateral is owned by men. So they have lower access to land, savings, and credit, and that limits their participation. We still have incidents of girls who are married at a very early age, below the age of 18, and this really limits them. So we need to look at it, and even the care. They carry a lot of responsibilities. Next. In terms of the gender responsive design, the design of the economic inclusion program in Kenya already shows when they form the Village and Saving Loaning Association, this is a group of about 10 to 25 people. And through this, they're able to do savings and they can access savings and credit. From the evaluation that we did, they were able to save around 2,140 per year, per the cycle, which was a 12 months. Then the consumption support that we give them is Kenya shillings 2,000. And again, studies have shown that the women are able to save and to use this money efficiently. So when you support a woman, then it means you have empowered the entire family. So the women are coached, and most of the mentors that we had, about 79% of the mentors that we had were ladies, and therefore they were able to train and coach and even train the women on life and entrepreneurship skills. And this gave the women the ability to be able to be part of the beneficiary welfare committees. These are committees of people who are participating in our economic inclusion program and even the cash transfer. So to address the social norms, what is done is that we have community sensitization, and we are very intentional in terms of inviting both the male and the female to ensure that the women are engaged, though we still have some challenges in areas where the male and female cannot sit together, but we are very deliberate in terms of the invitations that we make. The program activities itself ensured that we had both female mentors and male mentors. We have also looked at ways of sensitization and awareness on gender norms. Through our Kuza Jamii project, we are deliberate about having gender training and gender awareness programs that try to deconstruct the negative cultural norms. Next. So in terms of how the economic inclusion program has impacted on the women, from the evidence that we have both from the government-led economic inclusion program and from the Kuza Jamii program, is that the women now are able to make decisions. We have evidence that we have collected, and they're saying because of the income that they have, they are able now to sit as a family and decide on how they want to use that income. They've also testified that there is a great mutual respect among them among the family members. The men are now able to respect them, and even the community, at the community level, they are able to be respected because they are able now to join with the other members of the community and participate in the decision-making process. Usually when you have money in your pocket, when the women have money, then that means that is a happy family because there is reduced gender-based violence. In most cases, you'll find people fighting at the family level over resources or over finances. So when the women are empowered to have finance, then it means that we have reduced gender-based violence. And through that, they can also now be included in the community. As I told you, they formed the beneficiary welfare committees, and the women are actually the ones that are leading. You'll find them being the chairpersons of those committees. They are trusted. They will be the treasurers, and they're also trusted, so they become secretaries. So the women have acquired leadership skills, and they're also being elected as leaders. So there's a collective agency that women have now gained visibility. They can now be identified in the community, and they have great influence in terms of taking leadership roles and also participating. So when a woman is happy, then it means that the entire community will be happy. So there is overall well-being within the communities where we have empowered the women. Next. Next slide. The challenges that we've had, you've seen we have very positive things, impact about the economic inclusion in relation to the women. But despite that, we still have a few challenges. There is the traditional power structure where the men, because it is a patriarchal society, the men still feel that they are the ones who are supposed to make decisions. And in some communities in Kenya, this is so strong, and I think it is not easy. There's some reproductive roles, for example, when it comes to washing clothes, changing the diapers for the children, still men feel they cannot do it. So those reproductive roles limit. For example, if you have a child who is under 3 years, then you cannot leave this child with your husband because your husband still feels that you are the one to bathe the baby, you are the one to feed the child, he cannot feed the child. So that is also a limitation. And lastly is that men own and control access to productive resources. Most of the land that we have in Kenya is owned by men, because for you to get land, then you have to get what we call a title deed. And in most cases, these title deeds are owned by men. And most of the mega investments, you'll find the women participating in very small investment opportunities, but the bigger investment then will be identified with the men. But through all this, there are lessons that we have learned. That if you want to ensure that you have some equity or equality, then what you need to do is to try and get a buy-in from the men. So the project activities are culturally aligned. There we bring the men and women together and try and sensitize them, but we don't interfere with their culture. So there's the adoption of culturally appropriate technologies. For example, we have the jikos that we use for cooking. So we have tried to adopt in such a way that instead of using firewood, then we can use solar energy. So with this, then the women do not have to go fetching for firewood. We also have the income generating activities that benefit both the men and women, and we find these ones to be more acceptable. For example, if a woman is engaged in selling of tree seedlings, These ones will benefit both the men and women, and this is work that they can be able to do together. So we encourage such kind of income generating activities. We have also tried to ensure that we have accessible and non-confrontational tools that we use. A good example is the one that we use in the GESI model, where we have the happy family tree. We are looking at the roles of the man, looking at the roles of the women, and then we bring them together and see where is it that they can be able to meet. So when you bring them together, we engage them very early to ensure that there is that gender equality at the household level. So we have also involved the opinion leaders, the traditional leaders, the church leaders who are able to participate and they are trusted in the community. So they also support in terms of ensuring that we create awareness on the issue of gender equality and gender inclusion. Yes. Next. So you can see from this picture, this is one of the groups that we have empowered. What they're carrying in the envelope is money, and you can see the smiles that are on their faces. So this shows that the women are actually accepted, and this is a group that is 100% women, and we have so many of these women. So we are hoping that we will be able to empower many women so that we can have as many smiles as possible in this country. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynette, for the presentation. We have time for one quick question and then more questions towards the end. So one quick question. I know you mentioned that there's a second phase of this program, KCIP 2. So is there a way in which, I'm sure that there's many plans for KCIP 2, but what are some of the things you're doing differently based on what you've learned in phase 1 to maximize gender outcomes?
Thank you so much for that question. In KCEP 1, we were not very deliberate on women empowerment. And therefore, when we were coming up with our outcomes or our key result areas, we did not include the issue of gender. But this time we have included the issue of gender. And even in the development of the curriculum for our mentors and mentor supervisors, we have a module on gender. So this time we are very deliberate and intentional to ensure that we monitor that particular outcome.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynette, and I'm sure there may be more questions for you towards the end. But now I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Hasan Khaled, who's the Deputy Managing Director of the Pali Karma Sahayak Foundation in Bangladesh, and he will present the impact of the recovery and advancement of informal sector employment, RAISE, on women's access to resources and livelihoods, which you may remember from Nazia's framing is the second pillar. So please go ahead.
On behalf of PKSF, I welcome all of you in my presentation. My presentation will focus on RAISE project, and RAISE is a World Bank funded project. RAISE has a different interventions. One of the important interventions is the apprenticeship intervention, where the women and the female members are from the low-income people can join. The presentation will give a snapshot how address the constraints of apprenticeship intervention, its impact and way forward for women in financial inclusion and empowerment. Therefore, the title of my presentation, Apprenticeship, Unlocking Women's Potential in Bangladesh. So let me start with some statistical information of the labor force in Bangladesh. The women's participation in the labor force in Bangladesh is 43%, which is half of that of men, and 97% women are engaged in the informal sector, and their earning is 21% less than men. Under this situation, the financial inclusion component of RAISE, especially apprentices program, respond several gender-specific constraints by addressing women's limited skills, mobility, decent job, and fair wages. The 5 years RAISE project enrolled 73,000 unemployed youth, and where 35% are female, and 21,000 mastercraft person, where 30% would be female. So 6 months long apprentice training, which include 40 hours life skill training. So next. So transforming the potential into the empowerment. RAISE transfer unemployed young women into skilled labor force through a structured skill development and financial inclusion activities. The project waives age and educational requirements for women and give freedom to choice to join in their desired trades, and other issues are there. And women are paired with the experienced mastercraft person. But where there is a limited female mastercraft person, then they are paired with the male, but ensuring the appropriate work environment and clear instruction are given on professional conduct and maintain a gender sensitive issues. Apprenticeship intervention provide job placement and also support for startup financing, which is very important to understand and the outcome of the project. And this is why this job placement and the startup finance that makes the RAISE project a very outcome-oriented project. Alongside technical training, the project emphasized life skills content. Soft skill and mentoring are very crucial for women's empowerment. Life skill training includes respectful behavior, then personal protection and how to report any concern, etc. So next slide, I will just tell the story of a young girl. Her name is Margina, and this story will tell the impact of the RAISE apprenticeship program. Margia is a 21 years old girl, and after the death of his father, she was compelled to stop her education, and she whole family burden actually came to her. So she was puzzled, but she has a dream, and she faced different challenges to recover the family financial problems. Under the apprenticeship intervention, Margia receives training on business, then communication, marketing, and as well as the confidence building training, awareness. And now Margina is running a kitchen. The name of his restaurant is Margina's Dream Kitchen, and her earning is 1,200 USD per month, and 8 youth are working in Margina's kitchen, and out of that 3 are female. And this is not the only one story, a story of the apprentice. This is the there are many cases case of the successful apprenticeship development apprentice through the RAISE project, and 67% of the enrolled female member of RAISE, they are now engaged in a decent job, and 23% they have launched their own enterprise. So this information actually demonstrating the program's strong impact on women's economic empowerment and self-reliance. So what we learned from our experience next. So considering the socio-economic perspective, flexibility in training schedule, women-friendly trade, safe venues, and mentorship by female mastercrafts significantly improve women's engagement and completion rates of the training. Race proves that technical skills alone insufficient. That is why confidence, communication, along with business skill, empower women to seek better opportunities. And the way forward is that promote non-traditional livelihoods. Most of the apprentices are engaged in very traditional income generating activities. Now, under the project, we are try to develop the female participant to go in the non-traditional IG activities. For example, the graphic design, mobile service, etc. And continuation gender responsive monitoring is very important to understand the employment status, income growth, and as well as the sustainability of the business. And last way forward is the expand the childcare services. RAISE has plans to expand the childcare services because we strongly believe that it will increase productivity and waste if they have if this informal sector apprentice have a childcare support. So this is the end of my presentation. Lastly, I want to say one thing. There's two issues that are seriously considered in any kind of financial inclusion initiatives for the low-income community. Financial inclusion without training and skill development will not bring effective result. And second, the training should be very much demand-driven rather than supply-driven. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Khaled. We have one quick question, time for one quick question now, and then more questions at the end. You mentioned towards the end of your presentation something very interesting around the provision of childcare, and I think a lot of us agree that childcare is such a opportunity, but also barrier for women. So, in maybe a minute or two, can you tell us a little bit more what you're doing in terms of childcare provision?
Well, childcare, especially the informal sector, is very challenging and very new one to us. So I understand that we have to face some of the challenges, but one of the strengths of PKSF that we prefer a different operational approach, that is learning by doing approach. PKSF has developed its whole modus operandi learning by doing approach. So we start with the challenges, but at this moment we can give you some challenges, but more challenges I can explain and how to overcome those challenges after execution of this childcare services. This is challenging, but we hope we have to overcome the challenge if we do a good plan.
Great, thank you very much. We'll be moving on to our next speaker. So I'm glad to introduce Adèle Fox, who's the Global Equality Advisor at Concern Worldwide, and she will present the work on the work from Malawi on the impact of couples training. And this addresses the third pillar that Nazia mentioned up front, the contextual barriers and gender norms, in the context of the Gender Transformative Graduation Program in Malawi. So over to you, Adèle.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction and for inviting me here today. So yeah, as Radu said, I'm going to talk to you about our Gender Transformative Graduation Program in Malawi, which was implemented by Concern Worldwide, where we looked at the impact of integrating a couples dialogue approach with Trinity College Dublin. Next slide, please. So just some background about the project. So it was a graduation program with 18-month cohorts. And in the main components of that graduation program included first the comprehensive targeting. So households who were living in extreme poverty in rural Malawi, which was Mangochi and Nsanje in this case. Then those households were targeted with consumption support, so monthly cash transfers. They were provided with skills training, so business skills and livelihood skills, and also coaching. And there were some life skills involved in that as well. Then they were engaged in village savings and loans group and supported with access to financial services. And then they received a capital or an asset transfer to kickstart their business. And all of this was supported by regular caseworker visits to their homes as well. So the project was implemented by Concern, but we partnered with Trinity College Dublin for some really exciting research within this project, which I'll talk to you about in a second. The project was run between 2017 and 22, which sounds like quite a long time ago, but because there was research involved, data was collected 5 months after the intervention had finished and also 17 months after. And the data collection is actually still ongoing. There's longitudinal data collection happening now as well, which is very exciting. So we'll get even more results about sustainability as we go forward. Then in terms of the kind of the context and the background that this project was designed in, we did some formative research around gender constraints, and some of the big things that came out were that decision making in the household was very male dominated. Women who were earning more money than men were perceived very negatively. They were often perceived as sex workers or engaging in sex for money, while they were also, women were also left to do all of the household chores in most cases, and men who did engage in those chores were in some cases accused of witchcraft, and there was a lot of kind of negative attitudes towards them. At the same time, the kind of academic literature and research that was available at the time was showing quite mixed evidence about gender targeting for graduation programs. So whether you targeted men or you targeted women, some were showing that one was more positive than the other and vice versa. So that was a bit mixed. And there was a lack of evidence about what would happen if you integrated a gender transformative approach. Next slide, please. So with that background, we included this research into our graduation program, where we had 3 treatment arms. So it was a randomized control trial. We had a control group who had no intervention at all. We had the first treatment arm, which targeted the female household members with all the graduation components that I mentioned. The second arm targeted the male household members with the graduation components. And the third arm targeted the females, but they engaged in couples dialogue with their husbands. And with this research, we aimed to do 2 things. So to understand the impact of gender targeting, whether you target male or female, what are the differences on graduation outcomes? And secondly, to look at any additional impact that these gender dialogue sessions might have on the same outcomes. So the approach itself, the couples dialogue approach, it was known as Umodzi, that's how we refer to it, and that means united in the local language. And it brought together 12 couples in different groups to discuss a range of issues around gender. So we had a curriculum that was developed based on that formative research. You can see this picture here of one of the sessions taking place. So we brought those couples together and we took them through the curriculum over 12 months. So 1 session per month for 12 months, talking about gender norms, gender roles, power and decision-making, household budgeting, violence, positive parenting, healthy communication, healthy relationships, and kind of helping them to create household vision, like a joint household vision, which they could keep coming back to. So through that process, we aimed to transform gender and power relations within the households, but also promote women's economic empowerment and agency. Next slide, please. So the results. What we found was that even at 17 months post-intervention, so really sustained, we found that targeting women while also including that gender transformative dialogue with their husbands improved a whole range of outcomes. So it improved women's economic agency in the other two treatment groups. It improved men's mental well-being. It meant that the couples stayed together for longer than they did. More couples were still together than they were in the other groups by the end of the project and after 17 months. It increased harmony between couples, so conflict resolution was better. Decision making was more collaborative. And it increased that division of household labor. So men were helping women more. Women were having more time for rest and more time for productive activities. Then at the same time, so those are kind of the gender and empowerment related outcomes and well-being outcomes. But at the same time, it also increased more livelihoods outcomes as well. So livestock value was higher, income was higher, and asset value was higher as well. And one of the quotes from one of the female participants, which I really liked, was she said, "Everything is upside down in a good way," which kind of just really, I think, short and sweet and kind of shows that these social norms, these gender norms that have been there for so long were starting to change for the better. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. So this shows us that integrating that gender dialogue approach is a necessity for achieving better and more sustainable outcomes in graduation. We got good results from graduation and we know graduation works as an approach, but integrating a gender dialogue makes the results even better. Umodzi, or that gender transformative approach, generated twice the economic benefits of graduation alone. Therefore, it's efficient for donors to fund such activities as an integral component of social protection. It's not just a nice to have, it's essential, is how we feel about it. This shows us it's such good value for money. And what we've seen is that some governments have been open to doing this. So the government of Malawi, and it was specifically the Ministry of Gender, have now officially adopted that Umodzi manual. After kind of seeing, they were engaged from the start, but they saw the kind of impact that it had. And then at the same time, Mauritania and Cameroon had social protection, national programs, cash transfer programs, which incorporated research, which built on this research that we did in Malawi. So that was implemented not by Concern, but by the World Bank Gender Innovation Lab and Trinity College again, who then built on that research from Malawi to look at other ways of doing gender transformative work as well, and to see what the different impact is. And then in Malawi, because of the research design, we weren't able to include a community level intervention. But we know that is actually key, and that is something that we would always advocate for doing. We would always try to ensure that we have that in other projects. It's just in Malawi, we're a bit restricted. But that can be done through various ways and multi-channels. Religious and community leader engagement, as one of the other speakers was talking about, gender champions, community-wide events and activities. And I think somebody even mentioned the Cameroon example here, where they were using radio, videos, drama. You know, there are different ways to try to gain those impacts as well. And the last slide is just for reference. So when you get the presentation, you've got links to Concern's graduation programming, more on the research that I presented here, and a video which shows you some of the impact directly from the program participants themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adèle. One quick question now, and then there will be more towards the end. You mentioned towards the end about the importance of the community aspect in gender norms change. Maybe in a minute or two, can you tell us a little bit more about, you know, your organization, so Concern's experience in implementing community-wide approaches?
Yes, so one great example that we have is from Afghanistan, where we were doing a similar project to this, was women's empowerment in agriculture. And given the context there and the specific constraints there, we engaged religious leaders in a very structured way. So we had a manual that was developed specifically for them around gender in the light of Islam. We had a religious scholar who trained a number of religious leaders who could cascade to others, who could then cascade through their mosques. So this was a way of getting out to a wider group of people in the community that this was okay. These activities that these women were doing, whether they were your wives or whether they were other people's wives, because the mosques was mainly targeting men, this was endorsed by the religious leaders. So that was a really essential activity, like a really essential step for a context like Afghanistan. And we've done it in some other countries as well in different ways, like Niger, for example. So religious leaders, community leaders is, finding different ways to engage them is really key. And another key way we use in Concern is developing image cards that kind of match the sorts of messages that we have in the curriculums. And then you can have gender champions who have like simplified questions, simplified messages. They can use these context-specific images, and they can then be responsible for disseminating the messages to other men who also may not be in the program, but again, creating that sense that it's okay. And if men want to take up some of these behaviors, there are other men doing the same, and there are other men understanding that this might be a good thing. So it's all about creating that kind of acceptance in the wider community.
Great. Thank you very much. So after these three panelists, we'll conclude with our discussant. So it's my pleasure to introduce our discussant, Tatiana Rincón, who is the president for business development and global strategy initiatives at Fundación Capital. So Tatiana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Radu. And let's start by saying thank you so much and congratulations to PEI for the launch of this important in practice note. And listening to the presentations from our colleagues from Kenya, Bangladesh, and Malawi, that give us like an extraordinary illustration of why the three pillars like agency, resources, and context, social norms must work together if we want programs to lead to lasting empowerment. So even though like each focus in one pillar, we can see that all of them have the three components in their own initiatives, and that's why they have been successful. So since they were presenting, like I was thinking about like four key reflections, drawing both on what we have heard today and also on Fundación Capital's experience across Latin America. And let's start by saying that agency is an outcome we must intentionally design for. Like across all regions, we have seen that agency is built through repeated supporting decision-making and not simply through training sessions. So, for example, Dr. Lynett Ochuma from Kenya illustrated this beautifully. Like entrepreneurship, life skills training, all that created the conditions for women's increased decision-making power or income. And in Latin America, we observe the same principle. Women increase agency when they experience these small but meaningful wins, managing a small budget, planning a purchase, navigating through business decision, and coaching and peer groups help women internalize these wins and transform them into confidence and self-efficacy. So the message is clear. Agency is an outcome we must intentionally design for. We cannot just hope that we just focus women in our programs and everything happens organically. We need to be intentional on what we do. A second reflection, and this is something that can be drawn very, very clear from Mr. Hasan Khaled presentation from Bangladesh, is that access to resources must be gender intentional and not gender neutral. And like he reminded us that access to livelihoods is never equal by default. So in their program, for example, they paired women with experienced trainer, what he called like the master crafts persons, and adapting, for example, apprenticeships and integrating life skills training designed with this gender lens is exactly what allows women to convert opportunities into results. Because yeah, we create opportunities, but we need to reach and we need to get all these results. And from our work in Latin America, we have seen the same. For example, I mean, what we witness is that resources are not just inputs, they are enablers of choice, mobility, and economic exploration. And I think this is something that we have seen in all three presentations. For example, what we see today is that digital and financial capabilities are now basic enablers. It's something that it must be in all the programs, well, in my opinion, because without them, access to markets and services remain limited. So this is something that we must consider when we are designing with gender lenses. A third reflection that I can think about is that social norms can undermine everything unless we address them explicitly. And Adèle's presentations about Malawi that give us like the perfect sample. Umotsi is crucial. Like programs cannot assume that as long as women receive assets or training, like households will accommodate organically and they accommodate their participation. But we need to be consistent and think about that we need to be intentional. We saw that in the three presentations from Dr. Ochuma in Kenya, for example. We need to engage men and household members from the beginning. We experience also like at Fundación Capital in our graduation programs. We don't have like an evaluation as Concern has, but we have seen exactly the same when couples are involved in graduation programs in their business, like we see higher outcomes like monetary and non-monetary. When we start, for example, modeling equitable division of labors, when we integrate the conversations about aspirations and shared decision making, when we engage community and we start changing community narratives. We have done the same as, for example, our colleagues in Kenya. We involve sometimes local leaders to start transforming their mindsets and helping us in the community also, like changing like the way men sees women's work, and they lose fear on this. And at the end, it's beneficial for both, for women and men, as we saw in Adèle's presentation. And like my fourth reflection, and it is something that Nazia said very clearly at the beginning, is that the three pillars are mutually reinforcing each other, and failing in one weakens the entire chain. Sometimes we can focus only in monetary aspects, but as we saw, for example, in the evaluation with the three treatments, we can when we really have men and women, when we have like all these three pillars working together, the results are higher. I don't remember exactly the exact quote, but I remember that when we have like gender, when we have gender intentional design, the outcomes increase in 20%. So if we want to have more impact in our work, if we want to achieve better results, we definitely need to start thinking with gender lenses. And well, there's many things to talk about, but I think that we can just discuss them over Q&A. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share with all of you and to listen about these fantastic presentations. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tatiana, for the lively discussion. And now we'll move on to the interactive part of the session, in which we'll take questions from the audience. And the best way to do that is to type them in the chat. It's too tricky to let people talk freely with such a large audience. So we've already got a number of questions, and there's a lot to pick from. But I'll start with a question to Lynett. So when addressing social norms, are you targeting and engaging beyond the direct program participants, i.e. other community members, because gender norms are widespread, community normalized?
Thank you. For us, our target group is usually the household. So we have the direct participant, but we are targeting the household. And therefore, when we are having our trainings, all the household members are invited. They can attend. So that means that the information that we are transferring is reaching a wider group of people, because our target is a household. And once you target the household, then it is easy to transfer the knowledge to the community. And so that means that the entire community is involved. When we are having, for example, the GESI trainings, then we invite even those non-participants to also participate in the training. We also have the multisectoral committee members who are opinion leaders in the community. So when we are doing these trainings, they are also getting the information, and as opinion leaders, then they're able to also influence others. So yes, there is a multiplier effect in terms of the trainings that we are doing. We target households, we target community members, and we target opinion leaders who are able to influence others. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lynette. The next question was asked, I think, of multiple speakers. So I'll pose it to all of you. I think people just want to know a little bit more about the details of the support that's provided. So the question that was asked is, for how long do participants receive program support, particularly cash resources, if applicable to your program? So let's ask this to all the three panelists. So for how long do participants receive program support?
So maybe I can go first. In Kenya, the participants receive the program support for a period of 12 months. The asset transfer that we provide is one-off, but the consumption support that we provide is for 12 months. And beyond that, we don't give them monetary, we don't give them cash, but we continue to support them even beyond the program.
What
It's
about
very
in
similar for
Bangladesh?
Malawi. Oh, sorry.
What about in the case of Bangladesh?
One of the main issue when we design any kind of projects, that sustainability is a big concern for us. So we have designed our program in such a manner. So gradually we reduce the dependency of any kind of subsidies, any kind of grant from different interventions. So we have a design, we have a business model, how we shall continue the program after the completion of the projects. It's a detailed work we have done, but the bottom line is the sustainability of the real effective intervention is very concerned for us, and this is why we are developing our business model in such a manner that after the completion we can run the program.
And just to be clear, so in the current version, how long does the support last for, Mr. Khaled?
Okay, it's a 6 months.
6 months.
6 months.
Okay, great. And Adele, I think I cut you off, but did you mention it's the same length as the Kenya example?
Yeah, it's very similar. It's 12 months for cash, and then the other interventions kind of come in and then finish at different stages, but then the caseworker visits continue until the end to kind of keep up that motivation and encouragement and support that's needed.
Great. The next question goes back to Lynett and comes from a person in Nigeria who works in the wash sector. And they say that they are trying to tackle entrenched social norms. And their work has also necessitated strengthened social and behavioral change campaigns. However, these interventions should be implemented with due caution, as the social norms differ and we are trying to be context specific. So I think the question is really about what are some of the caution that we should pay when thinking about implementing behavior change.
One of the things that we've done, remember our economic inclusion is supported by World Bank. And therefore, we've put in place the environmental and social safeguards. So before we even design the program and even throughout the implementation of the program, we are ensuring that we are safeguarding, even in terms of the cultural aspect. So the message that we put across as we do awareness, as we do advocacy, we ensure that we are not interfering with any positive constructs of the society. The ones that are negative are the ones that we try to deconstruct. And this is done gradually through awareness, through campaigns, through advocacy. And we also involve the participants and the community members. So this is a design or a plan that we put together. So there's that stakeholder engagement plan that we put in place just to ensure that all the risks are mitigated. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynett. And maybe to follow to this, and I'll open this to all the three panelists and the discussant as well. Have you actually seen any instances of backlash in your program? So sometimes when there are programs targeted at women who may change some of the traditional power structure, there can be like real negative consequences, and we often call those backlash. So I'm curious if you've seen those. Sometimes it's hard to detect in quantitative numbers because they tend to be rare, but I think it would be good for us to be aware of any such instances. So I'll open it up to all three in no particular order.
Yeah. Actually, I was thinking exactly what you just asked about. And it connects with what Lynette just said, because what we try to do always is to try to be non-confrontational in our programs, in the way we address gender. Like, for example, we try to work with men leaders, being like examples in the community, and like doing and undertaking roles that are traditionally like women's roles, like a man hugging a child or giving food. Like I remember like a campaign in the Dominican Republic, which was amazing. It was like 15 years ago, but it was the time, it was the first time like people were looking at men in these roles in the national television. So like people slowly started to changing their mindset and see like men in these like caregiving roles. And that was fantastic. So that's the way we have always tried to work on gender. But honestly speaking, sometimes since we work a lot with governments, sometimes there are governments that are like from the right spectrum, and they are very fearful of the word gender. So sometimes I feel like, okay, I need to change the word gender and say, okay, I'm working with women's empowerment, or I have to change a little bit the label, but it's the same content, but I have to change just the label and said, okay, I'm working with women, and they start to loosen up, and they understand what we're talking about. But I remember once, for example, in one country that we were working with a minister, and the minister was called in the Congress because she was promoting like which was promoting gender, and gender was not acceptable at that time politically. So she had to show that it was women's economic empowerment. So like, especially like nowadays, we have to be very careful and see how we can change things, but in a non-confrontational way, like promoting what Adèle showed about umotsi and unity and union, and showing these fantastic results. And this is that's the way we have to continue working with gender without calling it gender.
Thank you,
So
Tatiana.
maybe I can come in
Go
and
ahead.
I can get context. Through the Kuza Jamii, a report was done, and it indicated that there was very minimal consequences for non-conformity. Very minimal consequences, but the ones that were identified is that if a woman or did not conform to the cultural norms, then the worst that could happen is that they would lose respect, they would lose trust, and there would be a bit of gender-based violence, but that was very minimal. Yes, thank you.
May I say something?
Please.
Yeah. So Bangladesh has a comparative advantage regarding these issues. You know that Bangladesh has a vibrant micro credit sector. So people knows that the involvement of the women in any kind of income generating activities, it not only the empower the particular or individuals, it will actually empower the whole family. And besides that, in our race project, we take the consent from the family also. So we don't see any kind of clash. Rather than we are seeing that there is a sort of inspiration for enrolling participants in the race project.
And I could just add something, actually going back to the Afghanistan example, if that's okay, because that was very interesting in the sense because the context was shifting in Afghanistan during the life of the project, and the women who were taking part should have had life skills, and the men should have been engaged, their husbands should have been engaged, and community leaders and religious leaders from the beginning. But because of the shifting context, the team decided to do those more sensitive sessions a little bit later and start with the more hard economic based, livelihoods activities, and then move on to the more sensitive ones. But what that meant was that even though the women's husbands had agreed for them to be part of the program, the women were then facing still lots of resistance from their husbands and their in-laws at home, trying to get them to quit the program. And when the program team started up the life skills sessions 8 months into all of that, and then subsequently started working with the husbands as well, that is when everything changed, and the women were able to use these skills they developed through the life skills primarily to go back home and use these negotiation skills, assertiveness skills that they'd been learning, and use them immediately with their families and convince them that actually this was a really good thing that they were doing, and to get that support from their families and buy-in, which led to the men saying, we want these life skills as well because we can see how amazing they are. And then the team kind of evolved with that and developed sort of complementary life skills for the men around listening skills and supportive skills and dealing with disempowerment. And it was very interesting, and all of that really came together really well to actually avoid that backlash. But it was definitely difficult for those women at the beginning in those first 8 months.
Great. Thank you, Adèle. The following question again was asked to Adèle, but it could try to expand it to all. So the direct question was, is community-wide or couples dialogue more cost effective? So maybe Adèle, you can start answering, but then in the meantime, maybe the other panelists can also think about whether and how cost effectiveness has played a role in their intervention.
So, I mean, I think we don't really know yet. And that was what the research in Mauritania specifically and Cameroon were kind of building on to see, can we now try to compare the outcomes and the costs of those as well? And that's something that I think is really interesting for us to be able to do. What is the most light touch intervention that we can find that has the same impact? So yeah, I think watch this space for more kind of hard evidence on that.
Yeah, and actually, like I would say, like one of the main challenges that we have for designing gender intentional programs is exactly the cost, because we need to add sometimes different components. Like, for example, I love to have like a childcare facilities, but that increases the cost of the program. Or sometimes we want to do community activities, even though, as Lynette mentioned, like we need to target households. There are certain activities where it's better to have like the entire community taking part, and that adds like additional costs. And like especially like in this context where we have to try to reduce the cost of the programs, it's more challenging. So we need to find like different ways of doing of working with gender, like maybe thinking about like the use of technology and see how we can, we need to be creative, because we cannot just, in the sake of cost reduction, we cannot just forget about gender, but we have to start thinking more, we have to be more innovative and more creative, because we need to really improve the outcomes of what we are doing, and we increase the outcomes when we really work with a gender perspective, but also we have to be aware of how we can manage this, and also since the cost of evaluation has reduced quite significantly, we can conduct maybe more evaluations and try to find more evidence on what works and what doesn't, and rely on that type of experiences to see how we can adopt these good practices in other geographies and in other countries.
Thank you. And Lynette and Hasan, how have you thought about the cost and cost effectiveness of your work?
Yes, Kenya as a country, we've thought about it. And you remember in my presentation, I said that one of the key things that we did, we were very deliberate and intentional as we moved to the scale up. So what we did in our design is that we embedded the GESI model in our design. So I think by embedding it in our design, it makes it a little bit less costly than it would have been, because then it becomes part and parcel of the program implementation, and therefore that reduces that reduces cost. And even for the mentors and the mentor supervisors, this is also part of their curriculum. So they've been given the skills, and once you transfer skill to someone, you cannot take it away. So that's one way that we have ensured that we invest in the human capital to try and pass this message to as many people as possible. So there's that intention to ensure that GESI is part and parcel of the economic inclusion programming. But we are still learning. We have experiences that we learned from KSEP 1. I'm sure as we move to KSEP 2, we'll have more learnings, and we can always be able to share experience on how to reduce the cost. Thank you.
In case of our race experience, initially our training was 6 months training. So now we are reducing this training into 4 months, but the master crafts who are providing the training, they will also provide some sort of financial benefit to the apprentice, so that they can more equip from under their guidance. So initially it was 6 months from the project, now the project will contribute 4 months. Rest of the 2 months will provide by the mastercrafts, because mastercrafts saw that the potentially of particular apprentice is very much needed to run his business. So this is why the mastercrafts are now coming, and they are willing to pay for this apprentice, for providing some sort of ways also.
That's really great. So the way I understand it, Hasan, is in the private sector becomes aware of this work and they have an interest to promote it. So they're willing to subsidize some of the costs. Is that the right understanding?
You are right. So,
okay. Great. There's a number of great questions here. One that I think was asked to Adèle, but I think all the others can reflect is the following. My research focuses on gender equality in non-traditional and emerging sectors such as digital and renewable energy. Despite the progress, gender norms and structural constraints still significantly restrict women's entry. What approaches have been most successful in shifting these norms and enabling women to access higher skill, male-dominated sectors? So Adèle, I'll start with you because it was asked to you, but I think others can answer as well.
I'm not sure I can answer that one really. I'm not sure that we in Concern can tell you which approaches work best. It's not necessarily an area we go specifically into. So maybe let the others speak. They might have something more relevant.
Okay. Who has a good answer or a good experience for this question? How to get women to participate in the male-dominated sectors?
We currently started a program, an employment program that focuses more on technology sectors for young women. So we are in the process of learning and testing. Sometimes in general graduation programs, like, okay, we target more women than men, but it's like a combined group of participants. In this particular case, we are working 100% with women, since they are very, like, their representation in this tech sector is very, very, very limited. But we are in the process of learning, but definitely this is something where we know that we have to work specifically in this, addressing these type of challenges, because like the digital gap is becoming wider, and like, at least I feel that like poverty will increase a lot because of these big technological gaps and all what is happening and is going on during the last couple of years with AI. So this is an issue that we have to address. So we may not have answers to that question, but definitely the future is happening, is here, and we need to find the solutions. You have to tell us with your thesis what you find out, and please enlighten our work.
In case of Bangladesh experience, yes, this is true. We focus much on the traditional enterprise for the female participants, but now we are moving to the non-traditional IGS, because there is an opportunity for generating more income. But we consider the social norms, and this is why we are trying to involve the women in digital marketing, then the technology-based, technology-based different types of activities, and also they are now involved in creating the bakery and other activities. So, and you'd be very pleased to know that some of the female are now working in the workshop also. because they have create a conducive environment for them. So we understand that there is if we consider the return of their services, non-traditional will give them more benefit. This is why we are focusing on different types of non-traditional IG activities for the women so that they can earn more. But we simultaneously considering the social norms also. So there is a motivational issue for the whole community is essential.
Great. Thank you. I think there's time for one last question. It's a great question, but I'll restrict your answer to maybe 35 seconds just to leave a bit of time at the end. So the last question for all is, what is the strategy to get to national scale and national sustainability without external resources? So see if you can answer that in 30 seconds. The hard question.
Maybe I go first for Kenya. We have developed the ultra poor graduation strategy, and one of the key things that we are saying is that we will want to co-finance our economic inclusion program. So we'll do resource mobilization as a multisectoral team, giving it the multisectoral approach, where we have the government, we have the private sector, we have the non-governmental organization, and we have the community-based organizations coming together to pool resources to ensure that we meet our goals and we are able to achieve the outcomes that we had planned for. So we have
Great.
developed a common Kenyan ultra poor graduation strategy.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. An answer in 30 seconds, Hasan.
Yes, we are creating the learning center throughout the country so that the participant apprentice, they can take the training and they can join in the services of from those learning center to the other periphery. So our bottom is that to reduce the donor support, we are making different types of learning center all over the country for different enterprise and trades.
Great. Thank you. Adèle, in 30 seconds.
I mean, I think from the NGO side, the best we can do for this is advocating, continuing to share the results, share the costings, the model, proposing models that can be followed based on what have worked in other countries. And I think that's the role that we can play.
Yeah, understood. Great. So there were a lot more questions that I had in my transcript from the chat, but we'll leave those for another session. Now, before we close, there's a poll that we want people to go through just to catch some direct feedback. So I think the poll will show up on the screen. Well, I don't know. Is it showing up? Okay, so it will come up on your screen, and I'll read the option just for the automated, or not the automated, but for the translation. So the first question is, would you use ideas and materials from this session for your future work in this area? And then you can choose from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And the second question is, would you recommend this series of webinars to your colleagues? Again, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So I think we have a couple of minutes for folks to mark their options, and then the poll will close. Great. So poll was closed. PEI colleagues will take a look at the results. And now we've come to the end of the session. In closing, I think we've learned from three distinct and very valuable panelists about experience in Kenya, Bangladesh, and Malawi. I think that there's a lot to learn from all these three, and I think that there's more materials in the note that was shared in the chat. So we'll conclude here, but looking forward to the next session in this series. So thank you again very much for joining at different countries, different time zones, and hopefully we can reconvene again in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great week. Bye.